On September 19th, 1972, in the quiet suburb of Springfield, New Jersey, a local woman and her dog were about to experience something horrific. The woman was unpacking groceries while her dog went through his usual off-leash romp through the nearby woods. But this day that dog would return with something a little bit extra, something out of a horror movie rather than suburban life. The dog carried a decomposed forearm and hand, so very distinctively human, and the woman immediately called the cops. This chilling find immediately triggered a massive search of the nearby woods. It didn't take long for searchers to find what they were looking for. Atop a jagged 40-foot cliff, a place already burdened with an ominous local nickname, lay the rest of the body. The place was called the Devil's Teeth, a name that seemed to write the first chapter of the story on its own. Before a single piece of evidence was collected, the narrative was already leaning toward the occult. The remains, identified through dental records, belonged to 16-year-old Jeanette De Palma, who had vanished 6 weeks earlier. And from the moment of her discovery, two starkly different stories about the scene of her death began to form, creating a conflict that has defined the case for over half a century. The first story, the one that would become legend, painted a scene of ritualistic horror. This version of events suggested a terrifying conclusion, that Jeanette De Palma was the victim of a satanic ritual. While this version is the most well-known account, there's also another competing narrative that, while equally tragic, removes the occult element. Jeanette De Palma was, by all accounts, a normal teenager. Friends and family described her as quiet and kind-hearted, funny, sweet, and firm in her convictions. What set the De Palma family apart, however, was their faith. In a predominantly Italian Catholic neighborhood, the family had recently become born-again Christians, attending church several times a week. This devotion made them outliers, and some locals reportedly viewed them as a bit unusual. Jeanette embraced this faith wholeheartedly, and she was deeply devout and harbored aspirations of becoming a missionary, dedicating her life to helping others. On the afternoon of Monday, August 7th, 1972, Jeanette's life was still filled with ordinary plans. She had spoken with her cousin earlier that day about meeting up with two boys they had met the night before. Around 1:30 that afternoon, she grabbed her purse, told her mother she was going to walk to the train station to visit a friend, and stepped out of her home for the last time. In the aftermath of her death, Jeanette's profound Christian faith was seen as the potential reason why she was targeted. The official investigation into Jeanette De Palma's death was, from the very beginning, a cascade of failures. The 6 weeks her body lay exposed to the elements meant that critical evidence was lost to decomposition. At the autopsy, the medical examiner couldn't determine a definitive cause of death as he found no signs of trauma. Notably, he told the press and police that he suspected strangulation was a possibility, but admitted that he couldn't prove it. Early leads were fairly robust, but unfortunately, they quickly evaporated. A tip about a homeless man known as Red, who lived in a makeshift campsite near the quarry and vanished around the time Jeanette disappeared, initially seemed promising. He was brought in and investigated, but ruled out completely. The most glaring failures, however, were institutional. The Springfield Police Department's entire case file on Jeanette's case officially disappeared, and let me just tell you, the circumstances are weird and don't make sense. The department maintains the records were destroyed in a flood caused by Hurricane Floyd in 1999. However, this explanation is deeply suspect, as a retired detective later stated that the file was already missing when he tried to access it in the 1980s. This has led some to believe that there may have been a cover-up, or that evidence of the nature of the event may have been officially sanitized to reduce the panic it would cause. The heart of the satanic ritual theory lies in the description of the crime scene. For decades, the narrative has been built on a foundation of macabre, occult-like details. Local media reports at the time featured lurid details, including a makeshift altar within a pentagram, crosses made from wood, and a perimeter of logs described as a coffin. In 2024, the photographs contained in what remained of the case file were released to a third-party investigative team. Upon review of these photographs, they determined that on the basis of the evidence presented, there was nothing to suggest that any of these occult elements were present. Of course, this has to be balanced against the fact that we are aware that the case file that existed circa 2024 isn't complete. You can't say on the one hand that this evidence rules out the occult, since the case file itself is tainted by its partial nature. What could potentially line up with the occult theory is what's missing from the scene. Jeanette was highly religious, and she always wore her cross necklace and never went anywhere without it. This necklace was absent from her body, a fact which has never been explained. The satanic theory surrounding Jeanette De Palma's death didn't emerge in a vacuum, and I think that's necessary to explore a bit here for this case. It took root in a society already fertile with anxiety about cults, the occult, and hidden evils threatening suburban tranquility. The early 1970s served as a cultural prelude to the nationwide satanic panic that would erupt a decade later, and the De Palma case contained all the key ingredients in embryonic form. Nationally, the cultural soil was well prepared to accept the seeds of occult forces playing a role in suburban life. The Manson family had shattered the peace and love image of the counterculture, instead portraying it as something disturbing and demonic. It proved that charismatic leaders could turn normal young Americans into brainwashed monsters, seeding a deep-seated fear of cults in the American psyche. Hollywood amplified these fears, bringing Satanism out of the shadows and into the mainstream, with blockbuster films like Rosemary's Baby and The Exorcist. This climate of fear was palpable in New Jersey. The nearby Watchung Reservation, a sprawling wilderness area, was already the subject of persistent local rumors about witchcraft and devil worship. This provided a geographic focal point for the theories that swirled around Jeanette's passing. The local atmosphere had also been poisoned just 1 year earlier by the infamous John List slayings in Westfield, only a few miles from Springfield. In 1971, List eliminated his entire family one by one, later claiming he did it to save their souls. While List didn't claim an occult motivation himself, his views were regarded by literally everyone as a disturbing twist on belief into something extremely malignant. This shocking event created a sense in the community that bizarre, religiously motivated violence could erupt anywhere, even in their own quiet suburban towns. Personally, I think the focus on this being a case with an occult element has actually served to shield a more conventional predator. Even if the initial scene did contain occult elements, as was initially reported, it's important to keep in mind that this may simply be a diversionary tactic. A predator with very conventional motivations could have used the Devil's Teeth area and the cultural background as a smokescreen to take the life of this innocent teenager. Now, that isn't to say that Jeanette wasn't the victim of someone with occult motivations. Unfortunately, though, given the apparent state of the case file, it seems like we will never know for certain, but more on this in a moment. The most compelling theory, at least in my view, is that Jeanette was the victim of a serial predator. And I'm just going to come out and say it right up front here. This doesn't preclude any weird occult elements either. Serial predators act in ways that are so detached from regular thought processes that normal people have that it's virtually impossible to figure out why they do what they do. We can seek to try to classify why serial offenders do it, but honestly, doing it for occult reasons is just as disturbed and vile as any other reason. So let's discuss the evidence as it stands and what we know. Her plan on August 7th was to hitchhike, a common practice at the time, but one that put her at immense risk. In the 70s, American teenagers were just randomly hopping in cars with strangers hoping to get to where they were going. While millions of rides happened each year without incident, predators began to realize there was a loophole here that they could exploit. They could freely pick up vulnerable people on the side of the road, and no one would bat an eye. This theory gained significant traction in the spring of 2021, when convicted New Jersey serial predator Richard Cottingham made a series of statements. Cottingham, who was active in the area at the time, alluded to the possibility that he had abducted and slain Jeanette after picking her up while she was hitchhiking. While this has not been confirmed by law enforcement, it represents a chillingly plausible lead. Furthermore, Jeanette's case bears similarities to other unsolved slayings of young women in the region, such as that of Joan Kramer. To use her as an example, she also disappeared while hitchhiking and was later found deceased in a wooded area. Basically, the intense focus on a satanic cult may have provided the perfect cover for a very real monster who was preying on the young women of New Jersey. Unfortunately, I think that this case may be very difficult to solve, given the systemic failures by the police department. The fact that one of the detectives who worked on the case couldn't access the file in the 1980s, combined with the official narrative that the file disappeared in 1999, is problematic. Some have suggested that this botching of the investigation may have been intentionally done, but there's no direct evidence whatsoever to support that right now. Further, it's always possible that the department, having never officially classified this case as a slaying, simply threw out most of the case file, and that act was the cover-up. Personally, I just find it very unusual that the cops claim to have lost the file in 1999 when there's an authoritative source from in the department who says it wasn't there in the 80s. What could solve the case potentially is modern forensic techniques, but again, this may not be possible given issues with chains of custody on the evidence. Further yet, it also appears that a large portion of the evidence was just simply lost, so the forensic approach may simply be out the window on this one. Ultimately, while it's impossible to say why Jeanette De Palma met this tragic end, we can only hope that there's enough evidence out there to get justice for this innocent teenager. Hey everyone, Jimmy here asking you to consider subscribing if you've made it this far. Also, don't forget to hit that notification bell so you get a notification every time I drop a new video. I upload very consistently, and by clicking that bell, you'll never miss an upload since I've been hearing from some subscribers that my new videos don't always get pushed to them. In the early 1980s, San Marino, California, was the picture of suburban tranquility. It was an affluent, insular community nestled near Los Angeles, a place of manicured lawns and quiet streets where serious crime felt like a distant abstraction. On one of these streets, Lorraine Road, lived a young couple just starting their life together. John Sohus, 27, was a quiet computer programmer who worked for a division of NASA. His wife, Linda, 28, was a talented and striking artist, standing 6 feet tall with auburn hair, who loved science fiction and worked at a local bookstore. They had married in 1983, and to get on their feet financially, moved into the main house of John's mother, Dee Dee. And just wait for it, because there was a guest house at play here, and it's going to factor into this story in a massive way. By all accounts, they were a happy, normal couple whose prospects were looking up. Linda had recently sold some major pieces at an art show, and they'd just bought a new pickup truck. Their domestic life, however, included an unusual element: a tenant living in Dee Dee's guest house. He called himself Christopher Chichester, a man who cultivated an air of eccentric importance. He was a master of social infiltration, understanding that in a community that valued pedigree, a fantastic story was often more compelling than a verifiable one. He told people he was a film student at the prestigious University of Southern California and hinted at royal lineage. He even handed out business cards that identified him as the 13th baronet of an ancient house, and at other times he name-dropped his Mountbatten cousins. For those of you who are unaware, Mountbatten is the official anglicization of the German name Battenberg, used by the House of Windsor, the British royal family. By dropping this slyly into conversations, he hinted to those in the know that he was from the high nobility at minimum. By joining a local church and charming the wealthy older residents, they gave him the social cover he needed to operate. They believed they were interacting with someone who could potentially be a real British royal. In return, he was able to semi-legitimately say he was friends with these wealthy and influential people. While many were intrigued, Linda wasn't, and she found Chichester creepy, and she and John made a point to avoid him. Then, in February 1985, the quiet life on Lorraine Road fractured. John and Linda told friends and family they were leaving for a couple of weeks for a top-secret government job interview for John in New York. After that, they simply vanished, leaving behind everything, including Linda's 4 beloved cats. In the weeks following the couple's disappearance, Christopher Chichester became the sole narrator of their story. He skillfully wove a tale designed to deflect suspicion and delay investigation, telling concerned friends that John and Linda were on a secret government mission and couldn't be contacted. To Dee Dee, he positioned himself as her official go-between, the only person who knew the details of her son's clandestine work. Initially, Dee Dee clung to this story, even repeating it to police and telling them she couldn't say more for fear of endangering the couple. But as weeks turned into months, the narrative began to fray. Bill collectors started calling for John and Linda, and friends grew more anxious. Dee Dee's confidence in Chichester crumbled, replaced by a creeping dread. She descended into the bottle and became a recluse, haunted by the silence from her son, and she perished in 1988, never knowing the truth of what happened to her son. The cover-up was a strange mix of elaborate cunning and breathtaking arrogance. To lend his story credibility, a series of postcards, seemingly written by Linda, were sent from Paris to her mother and friends. This was the cunning part, physical proof to sustain the lie long enough for him to make his escape. Yet, the execution was deeply flawed, and Linda's family knew she didn't have a passport or the money for a European trip. This recklessness was a core part of the perpetrator's psychology. When a San Marino detective finally came to the guest house to question him about the missing couple, Chichester met him at the door completely unclothed. He claimed to be a nudist and refused to dress up at all, just letting it all hang out for the detective. It was a bizarre act of dominance and deflection that ended the interview. And shortly after this encounter, Chichester also vanished. I really question how the detective managed to be taken seriously after letting a criminal escape in such a bizarre way. The case went cold until 1988, when the couple's pickup truck was discovered in Greenwich, Connecticut. The man who had been driving it, now using the alias Christopher Crow, disappeared before police could question him. The mystery lay dormant for years, and Dee Dee Sohus's house on Lorraine Road was sold, and the strange story of the vanished couple faded into local lore. Then, in May 1994, the new owners decided to install a swimming pool in the backyard. As excavators dug into the earth, they struck something solid. It was a fiberglass box containing plastic bags, and inside were the dismembered remains of a body. Forensic analysis revealed the remains belonged to an adult white male who had been slain through savage violence. The victim's skull had been crushed by multiple blows from a blunt object, and his body had been subject to further indignities. The brutality suggested a crime of intense personal rage, while the methodical dismemberment and burial pointed to a cold-blooded attempt to conceal the evidence. Though police strongly suspected the victim was John Sohu's, confirming it was a challenge. John had been adopted, so there were no known biological relatives against whom to compare DNA samples. It wasn't until 2011, with the advent of new forensic technology, that the bones were conclusively identified as those of John. While the Sohu's case languished, the man once known as Christopher Chichester was busy constructing a new life, or rather, a series of them. After fleeing California, the German immigrant Christian Karl Gerhardsreiter moved to Greenwich, Connecticut, and reinvented himself as Christopher Crowe, a supposed Hollywood producer. He was a charming man who spoke German fluently, and no one who speaks German could be a bad man, right? He talked his way into jobs at Wall Street brokerage firms, but his cons were clumsy. He was fired from one after it was discovered he was using the social security number of serial predator David Berkowitz. He then moved on to his most audacious and successful impersonation. Relocating to New York and Boston, he became Clark Rockefeller, an eccentric and reclusive heir to the legendary American dynasty. As Rockefeller, Gerhardsreiter achieved the status he had always craved. He joined exclusive clubs, wore ascots, and spun tales of his fabulous fictional life. His ultimate act of validation came when he met and married Sandra Boss. She was a highly successful Harvard Business School graduate and a partner at the consulting firm McKinsey. Her unimpeachable credentials gave his fraudulent identity a powerful veneer of legitimacy. Despite Boss being the sole breadwinner, earning over $1 million a year, Gerhardsreiter maintained absolute control over her finances and her life. The carefully constructed world he built began to collapse when Boss filed for divorce in 2007. She had begun to suspect that the entire identity he had constructed was indeed a complete lie, and while she wasn't able to figure who he was, she figured out he wasn't Clark Rockefeller. For a narcissist like Gerhardsreiter, the loss of control was an intolerable injury. On July 27, 2008, during a supervised visit in Boston, he executed a planned abduction of their 7-year-old daughter. The kidnapping triggered a massive FBI manhunt that put the face of Clark Rockefeller on news broadcasts across the country and in Canada. The Rockefeller family quickly clarified that they had no idea who this guy was, and that he had no connection whatsoever to the famous family. It was this crime, born of desperation and hubris, that would finally solve the slaying he had committed 23 years earlier. A week later, he was arrested in Baltimore, where he had already set up a new life as Chip Smith, a yacht captain. The national publicity surrounding the case blew the lid off his 30-year con. Fingerprints taken after his arrest were matched to prints on an old immigration document. This definitively proved that Clark Rockefeller, Christopher Crowe, and Christopher Chichester were all the same person, Christian Karl Gerhardsreiter. It turned out that he had arrived in America in 1978 as a foreign exchange student and had charmed his way into a sham marriage for a green card. In 2011, while nearing the end of his Massachusetts prison sentence for kidnapping, Christian Gerhardsreiter was charged with the slaying of John Sohus. The trial, which began in 2013, was a masterclass in prosecutorial storytelling. With no strong forensic evidence or witnesses to the crime, the case was built circumstantially. The prosecution wove together a damning narrative from the clues Gerhardsreiter had carelessly left behind. The most crucial pieces of evidence were two plastic bags found wrapped around John's skull. One was from the bookstore at the University of Southern California. The other was from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Gerhardt's writer had attended classes at both schools, effectively leaving his calling card in the grave. And honestly, it's things like this that make me wonder how this buffoon was able to pull off his cons for so long. Witnesses from San Marino, now elderly, testified about his strange behavior. A church acquaintance recalled Gerhardt's writer borrowing a chainsaw around the time the couple disappeared. Another remembered him trying to sell a fancy Turco-Persian rug that appeared to have very unusual stains on it. The witness hadn't bought the rug, so it couldn't be tested to prove anything with certainty, but it was yet another piece of evidence against this predatory con man. The defense, acknowledging their client was a grifter, employed a strategy of misdirection that mirrored Gerhardt's writer's own methods. They pointed the finger at the one person who couldn't defend herself, the missing Linda Sohus. They argued that Linda, a tall, physically imposing woman, was more capable of the attack than Gerhardt's writer, which I have to say is probably as audacious as it is disgusting. They entered into evidence the postcards from Paris, which they claimed proved she was alive after John was slain, but despite this, the jury wasn't convinced. I'm going to give you a second to guess how this defense worked out, and I mean a literal second here. In April 2013, after deliberating for less than a day, they found Christian Gerhardt's writer guilty in the first degree. He was sentenced to 27 years to life in prison. The verdict finally brought answers to the family of John Sohus. After nearly 3 decades of uncertainty, the perpetrator had been held accountable, but the conviction only solved half of the mystery that began on that quiet San Marino street in 1985, and the question of what happened to Linda Sohus remains unanswered. Her body has never been found, and she is still officially classified as an endangered missing person. The prevailing theory, held by prosecutors and investigators, is that Gerhardt's writer eliminated her as well, disposing of her body in a location that has never been discovered. The defense's theory that she was the perp who fled was a courtroom tactic unsupported by any evidence whatsoever, aside from the likely fake postcard from Paris. Gerhardt's writer himself has claimed that Linda is still alive, even hinting at his sentencing that he had information about her whereabouts. This appears to have been one last attempt by this sick individual to try to assert power, though it appears no one was buying what he was selling. It begins with a photograph, as so many great mysteries do. Taken in February 1901 at DeYoung Studio in New York City's bustling Union Square, the portrait captures a man and a woman of striking confidence and style. He is handsome, well-dressed, and would soon be known to lawmen across 2 continents as Harry Longabaugh, the Sundance Kid. She's arrestingly beautiful, her expression poised and intelligent, and we know her as Etta Place, but if you asked her parents, that name would be out of place, because she wasn't born that way. Pinned to the lapel of her fashionable dress is a delicate gold watch from Tiffany's, a recent gift not from her companion, but from their partner in crime, Butch Cassidy. This small detail hints at the complex, 3-way partnership that defined their lives. The couple purchased 5 copies of the portrait, mailing them to family and friends as a de facto marriage announcement, though no official record of their union has ever been found. Days later, they, along with Cassidy, boarded the British steamship Herminius and sailed for Buenos Aires, fleeing the long arm of the law for a new life in Argentina. But what was intended as a private commemoration of their future soon became a weapon used against them. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency, relentless in its pursuit of the Wild Bunch, acquired a copy of the photograph. Almost overnight, the image was transformed from a personal token into the centerpiece of wanted posters, reproduced and distributed from the plains of Wyoming to the pampas of Patagonia. The very portrait meant to celebrate their bond became the primary tool that would hound them and ultimately contribute to its dissolution. This artifact is the perfect metaphor for Etta Place herself. It provides the most concrete proof of her existence, a clear and confident face staring out from the turn of the 20th century. Yet it tells us nothing of who she was before that moment or what became of her after. The photograph is both a window and a wall. It allows us to see her, making her vividly real, in a way other historical figures are not, but it captures a persona, an alias, at the very moment she was creating it. By disseminating this image, the Pinkertons effectively cemented the identity of Etta Place, while simultaneously erasing any trace of the woman she had been before. The photograph marks the beginning of her official story and the end of the trail to her origins. She stepped out of complete anonymity, lived in the historical spotlight for 5 years, and then vanished back into the mists. She left this single haunting image as the only definitive proof she was ever there at all. Every part of the identity we know was a careful construct, starting with the name itself. Place was the maiden name of Sundance's mother, a convenient alias he often used to cover his tracks. The name she actually used when signing hotel registers in the United States was Ethel. The Pinkertons believed her birth year was around 1878. However, it's unclear how they came to this conclusion, or if it was simply an educated guess based on her youthful appearance. Those who met her consistently remarked on a fascinating set of contradictions. She was described as cordial and refined, and spoke in an educated manner that suggested an East Coast background. Yet, this same woman was an expert writer and a crack shot with both a Roscoe and a rifle, skills more suited to the rugged frontier. This has led to historians trying to find any records of her birth or how she arrived in the West, and perhaps surprisingly, they have had some luck. Some stories suggest that she was a school teacher who was brought out from the East, while other stories suggest that she was working in society's oldest profession. And perhaps surprisingly, these two personas and professions aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, and there's actually some decent circumstantial evidence for it. In fact, the most plausible, though still unproven, theory about her identity provides a compelling synthesis of both narratives. The 1900 census records for San Antonio list a woman named Ethel Bishop, living in a house of ill repute often visited by Butch, Sundance, and the Wild Bunch. Crucially, her occupation is listed as unemployed music teacher, suggesting that she fell upon hard times. By early 1901, the pressure from the Pinkertons had become immense. Following a string of audacious train and bank robberies, the Wild Bunch was the most wanted gang in America, and their world was shrinking. Butch, Sundance, and Etta made a bold decision. They would flee the country and start over. After their stop in New York City for photos and fine jewelry, they set sail for South America in 1901. Their destination was both a hideout and a place of reinvention. Using the substantial profits from their last robberies, they purchased a sprawling ranch in the remote Cholula Valley of Patagonia in Argentina. They intended to go straight, and Etta herself held title to more than 2,000 acres in her own name. For a time, the remains of the Wild Bunch became the Mild Bunch, probably more concerned about the price fluctuations of beef and grain than any passing trains laden with riches. Surprisingly, given the time involved, they traveled back to America on a couple of occasions, but by 1905, things were looking rough, and the law had caught up to them. They fled from Argentina into Chile, seeking refuge in the shadow of the Andes Mountains. Here they resorted back to their old ways, with Etta participating in a bank robbery in 1905. But simply put, she was over it, and by 1906, she had made her decision. Well, that's what historians assume, since all evidence suggests that Sundance didn't want to lose her. Sundance escorted her back to the United States, a clear sign that she was the one who initiated the final separation. In June of that year, he accompanied her on the long sea voyage from Chile to San Francisco. After seeing her settled, he turned around and sailed back to South America alone. He would be eliminated within 2 years, reportedly cut down alongside Butch Cassidy in a firefight with Bolivian soldiers in November 1908. Etta, however, didn't vanish the moment she stepped off the boat. Her last confirmed location was still in San Francisco in 1907, a full year after her arrival. The final tantalizing ripple from her life appeared in 1909. A woman matching Etta's description approached the U.S. Vice Consul in Chile, requesting assistance in obtaining a death certificate for one Harry Longabaugh. No certificate could be issued, and the woman's identity was never officially confirmed, though the vice consul was familiar with her appearance from the wanted posters. But if it was Etta, this act represents the final, logical step in a carefully planned exit. For over a century, the vacuum left by Etta Place's disappearance has been filled with speculation. The most popular and enduring theory was that Etta Place was actually Ann Bassett, the queen of the cattle rustlers from Colorado. The case was compelling. Bassett was born in the same year as Etta, ran with the Wild Bunch, was romantically linked to Butch Cassidy, and was also a skilled rider and shooter. Most convincingly, she bore a striking physical resemblance to Etta. In the 90s, a computer facial recognition analysis performed by a scientist at Los Alamos National Laboratory concluded they were almost certainly the same person. However, the theory collapses under the weight of contemporary evidence. A comparison of their timelines, based on legal documents and contemporary newspaper reports, proves they were two different women in two different places at the same time. To give just one example, Ann Bassett was standing trial in Wyoming for cattle rustling at a point in 1904 when Etta Place was documented to have been in South America. Some have made pretty wild claims about the use of body doubles, or claimed that Etta could have made it back to stand trial, both of which strike me as incredibly unlikely. Bassett lived a long and public life until her death in 1956, never once claiming to be Etta Place, even in her own memoirs. Anyway, I've put up the only known photographs of each woman side by side, and personally I think there's a pretty strong resemblance. But the other facts just don't add up. The second major theory identified Etta as Eunice Gray, a woman who ran a house of ill repute and later a hotel in Fort Worth, Texas. This theory was championed by a local newspaper editor who noted that Gray claimed to have spent time in South America for her health during the same period Etta was there. For decades, the lack of a photograph of a young Eunice Gray kept the theory alive. That changed in 2007 when a researcher located photographs of her, and they really don't look anything alike at all. However, it's always possible that a photograph could have been incorrectly marked or cataloged, meaning that this photograph may not depict Eunice Gray. Unlike Butch and Sundance, whose story has a likely finale in Bolivia, Etta's story simply stops. After 1909, she simply vanishes from the record, and there's nothing further to indicate what actually happened to her. Personally, I suspect that she may have simply stayed somewhere in South America, given that she was a high-profile wanted fugitive in the United States. That said, her status as a fugitive in America didn't stop her from coming back to the country previously. Further, it's always possible that she simply got tied up with the wrong sort of people in South America. Etta Place clearly wasn't the sort of person who contented herself with living a normal life, and it's very possible that she may have come to harm from one of the people she met. At the end of the day, the disappearance of Etta Place will likely continue to remain one of the Old West's unsolved mysteries. That said, I have a faint hope that eventually we'll find a diary attributed to her or someone close to her that may break the whole historical cold case wide open. State College, Pennsylvania, on Halloween night 2001, was a town electric with the energy of a major university letting loose. For the thousands of students at Penn State, Halloween isn't just a holiday, it's an institution. And on that night, 21-year-old Hyun Jong Song, known to her friends as Cindy Song, was part of the celebration. Cindy was a bright and hard-working student just months from graduation. She was juggling 2 part-time jobs along with her studies, but she wasn't thinking about her responsibilities that night. That night was supposed to be all about fun. She and her friends had decided on a costume theme, and Cindy was dressed as a bunny. It was a simple, playful costume, and by the end of the night, it became the last known picture of her, a haunting symbol forever linked to the dark mystery that was about to unfold. The night began at Players Nightclub, a popular spot on West College Avenue, where Cindy and her friends danced and socialized with other students. The party continued until around 2 o'clock that morning, at which point the group left the club and went to a friend's house to hang out for a while longer. At approximately 4 o'clock on the morning of November 1st, the Halloween festivities were finally over. A friend gave Cindy a ride back to her off-campus apartment at the State College Park Apartments on West Clinton Avenue. The car pulled up to the curb and Cindy got out. In a small, seemingly insignificant decision, her friend drove away without waiting to see her safely walk through her front door. That moment, in the pre-dawn quiet of a sleeping town, was the vanishing point. It was the last time anyone is known to have seen Cindy Song alive, and the solid, verifiable timeline of her life ends right there, on that sidewalk. For 3 days, there was complete radio silence from Cindy. Cindy didn't show up for her jobs, and she didn't answer her phone. Her friends, whose calls went unanswered, began to worry. Their concern grew into a quiet dread until, on November 4th, they contacted the police and officially reported her missing. The news sent a shockwave through her community and reached her family in South Korea, who immediately flew to Pennsylvania to face a parent's worst nightmare. When the Ferguson Township Police entered Cindy's apartment, they found a scene that was somehow both undisturbed and deeply disturbing. There were no signs of a struggle, no shattered windows or splintered doorframe indicating a violent, forced entry. Inside, her backpack was on the floor, where one might drop it after coming home. Her cell phone had been left behind, and on a surface lay the false eyelashes she had worn as part of her costume, removed as if she were getting ready to wind down for the night. These details offered clear proof that Cindy had made it inside her apartment after being dropped off. But the scene also presented a fundamental contradiction. While her backpack and phone were there, her purse, which contained her wallet, credit cards, driver's license, and keys, was gone. The items left behind suggested she had come home to stay, while the items that were missing suggested she had left again. The investigation was immediately hampered by 2 critical losses of potential evidence, one a matter of bad luck and the other a tragic misunderstanding. Investigators theorized that Cindy, finding herself home after a night of drinking, might have decided to walk to a nearby 24-hour supermarket for a late-night snack. It was a plausible idea, but by the time police went to the store to check, the window of opportunity had closed. The store's security camera system recorded on a loop, and the tapes from the morning of November 1st had already been recorded over. This routine activity erased what might have been the last images of Cindy or a potential abductor. Compounding this loss was a well-intentioned but devastating act. Shortly after the police conducted their initial search of the apartment, Cindy's grieving parents arrived. Unfamiliar with American law enforcement procedures and overwhelmed by their circumstances, they cleaned their daughter's apartment. In doing so, they potentially erased any subtle forensic clues that might have been left behind, as a forensic team had yet to go over the scene with a fine-tooth comb. These two events, the erased tapes and the cleaned apartment, created an information vacuum in the crucial first 48 hours of the case. The trail went cold almost before the search had truly begun. With no physical evidence to guide them, investigators had to rely on tips. A few days into the investigation, a startling one came from nearly 200 miles away in Philadelphia. An eyewitness claimed to have seen a young woman who looked like Cindy in the city's Chinatown district. According to the witness, the woman was in a car with a man, visibly distressed, crying, and yelling for help. The witness even provided a description of the man, described as being Asian and having a medium build, an olive to light brown complexion, and medium-length dark hair. This account was compelling enough for police to create a composite sketch, which was then circulated to the public. For a moment, it seemed like a major break, a tangible clue in a case that had none. Unfortunately, the promising lead soon dissolved under scrutiny. As police interviewed the eyewitness further, her story began to change, and key details shifted, including the age of the woman who was seen. Investigators were ultimately unable to verify any part of her account, and the credibility of the tip collapsed. The consensus became that it was likely a tragic case of mistaken identity, or perhaps even someone who wanted to insert themselves into an investigation with a fake tip. Notably, this isn't that unlikely, given that Cindy Song's disappearance had become quite a high-profile case. For 2 years, the case remained frozen, until one day in 2003 when everything appeared to change. The break came from an unlikely source, a career criminal named Paul Weekly, who was facing felony charges and looking to make a deal. He told investigators a horrifying story involving two of his criminal pals. He claimed that Hugo Selensky and Michael Kurkowski had abducted and slain a young, attractive Asian woman from State College. Weekly's account included chilling details, suggesting the men had kidnapped the woman and held her captive for a period before ultimately slaying her. For investigators who had nothing, this was the most significant lead they had ever received. Acting on Weekly's information, police from Center County traveled to Lucerne County to execute a search warrant on Hugo Selensky's 6-acre property. What they found there defied imagination, and it turned out the backyard was a clandestine cemetery. Investigators began unearthing human remains, some of which had been burned in a makeshift pit in an attempt to destroy evidence. Initially, 5 bodies were recovered, but a later grand jury report suggested the total number could be as high as 12. The discovery confirmed that Selensky wasn't just a small-time criminal. He was a monstrous and prolific serial predator. Weekly's credibility soared, and the proof was right there, buried in these makeshift graves. Among the remains, police identified 2 of the individuals he had named: Michael Kurkowski, one of Cindy's alleged abductors, and Kurkowski's girlfriend, Tammy Fassett. The discovery of this mass grave instantly made the story about a random college student's abduction seem terrifyingly plausible. Here, however, the case slams into its most enduring wall. While Weekly's testimony led police to a mass grave and ultimately helped secure a 2015 conviction against Hugo Selensky for other slayings, there was one problem. Despite extensive searches of Selensky's property, investigators found absolutely no evidence whatsoever related to Cindy Song. Furthermore, Weekly's motives and methods came under question. Investigators discovered that he had been extensively researching Cindy's case online before coming forward. This suggested he could have woven details of a famous unsolved disappearance into his true confessions to make his testimony more valuable. During Selensky's trial, Weekly himself admitted on the stand that he had repeatedly lied to investigators in his initial interviews in an effort to minimize his own role in the crimes. This creates the central paradox of the Cindy Song case. Paul Weekly can't be entirely dismissed as a liar because his information led to the discovery of multiple victims. Yet he cannot be fully trusted because ultimately he's an admitted liar who researched the case and had a powerful incentive to fabricate parts of his story. This contradiction has left the investigation in a state of permanent limbo. Hugo Selensky, now serving a life sentence, remains the primary person of interest, but without any direct evidence, the theory remains entirely unproven. While Cindy is officially still considered a missing person, she is presumed to have been slain despite her body never having been found. In 2013, a small measure of hope came through science when the authorities obtained DNA samples from Cindy's biological parents. Those samples were entered into national databases for missing persons and unidentified remains, a final, desperate measure to find a match somewhere. Cindy's case file has never been closed, and her case remains an open and active investigation. Notably, her disappearance left such a mark on the community and the department that it was a key factor in the creation of a dedicated cold case task force. My theory on this one is simple. It wasn't Selensky, and Weekly lied to try to get a better deal. We know that Weekly was thoroughly researching Cindy's case prior to her disappearance. This wasn't just him confirming the facts, because he came to the cops and advised that Selensky and his associate had slain a young Asian woman around that time. He tried to pass it off as if he knew nothing about Cindy's case, despite having fully researched all the public information prior to going to the authorities. My personal theory on this one is that this was a random abduction by a predatory stranger who was cruising the streets of a college town on Halloween night. While I can't prove it, of course, this makes a lot more sense to me than the Selensky theory, since none of the hard evidence matches up with him. Hey everyone, Jimmy here. Just reminding you to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell and turn on all notifications. Also, don't forget to check out the Patreon or the YouTube membership if you want to support my channel further. For 4 years, the identity of a teenage girl discovered in rural Texas remained a mystery. In June 2021, a property owner in Wharton County stumbled upon skeletal remains in a secluded brushy area off County Road 225. The victim had been shot multiple times in the head, and with no name and few clues, she became known only as the Wharton County Jane Doe. It wasn't until June 2025 that authorities finally gave her a name. She was 16-year-old Yami Makiela Beltran. This revelation cracked open a chilling story of her disappearance and slaying, and marked the beginning of the end of a long-running cold case. Yami Beltran was last seen in April 2021 in her hometown of Houston, Texas. She was just 16, but despite this, her sudden absence initially raised little alarm. In fact, her mother did not report Yami missing until 15 days later. According to unverified accounts, the delay happened because Yami's mother received a disturbing phone call informing her that her daughter had been slain, and she was in fear. On June 18, 2021, about 2 months after Yami disappeared, her remains were found in Wharton County, roughly an hour's drive from Houston. A local landowner clearing brush came upon a human skeleton in an isolated field near Hungerford. Investigators noted that the body had been left exposed to the elements with no attempt at burial. The Fort Bend County medical examiner determined that the Jane Doe had died from multiple gunshot wounds to the head and had likely been dead for several weeks or more. Because of advanced decomposition, even basic details like her ethnicity couldn't be determined, but she was thought to be of white, Hispanic, or mixed Native American heritage. Investigators found a few poignant clues with the body. The unknown girl was wearing a gray shirt emblazoned with the word Ohana and a picture of Stitch, the Disney cartoon character. She also wore shorts printed with coffee mugs and donuts, and a lightweight tan hooded jacket. On her fingers were 3 silver rings, one with 2 entwined hearts, and 2 others with white stone settings. These personal items were carefully photographed and shared with the public in hopes that someone might recognize them. Despite these efforts, no immediate match was made to a missing person. The mystery girl did not correspond to any open case in Wharton County, which puzzled local officials. Investigators strongly considered that the victim might not be local at all. She was thought to likely be a trafficking victim or runaway from far away, whose family had no idea what happened. For nearly 4 years, the Jane Doe remained unidentified, and the case went cold. The breakthrough finally came in mid-2025 when advances in DNA analysis and persistent detective work put the puzzle pieces together. Yami's mother had provided a DNA sample, which was uploaded to CODIS. In June 2025, specialists at the University of North Texas Center for Human Identification in Fort Worth managed to match the unidentified remains to Yami's mother. Nearly 4 years after her body was found, this 16-year-old girl was no longer anonymous. Yami's family in Houston had no idea that the unidentified girl found in the next county was their missing daughter, and had never heard of the case before. Presumably, had the case received wider attention, her identity may have been given back to her earlier, since she had a lot of identifying items with her. Identifying Yami answered the biggest question, who was the victim, but it also raised an obvious urgent follow-up question. Once her name was known, a harrowing narrative of Yami's final moments emerged. According to a witness, a female friend of Yami's, her demise was not a random crime, but an act of betrayal by an older predator who was claiming to be her boyfriend. On the night she disappeared in April 2021, Yami was riding in a vehicle with her 27-year-old quote-unquote boyfriend, Luis Omar Beltran Mendoza. The friend was also in the vehicle, and they were heading down Interstate 45 near Houston. At some point, an argument erupted. Beltran Mendoza allegedly struck Yami in the face while driving. Yami, wounded and furious, threatened to report him to police for unspecified crimes he had been involved in. That threat proved fatal, and Beltran Mendoza pulled out a gun and shot Yami 3 times in the head at point-blank range. Beltran Mendoza then threatened to eliminate the other young woman as well. He drove to a rural spot, presumably the field in Wharton County, and dumped Yami's body. The terrified friend was held captive by him for a few days before he finally let her go, warning her not to tell anyone. Traumatized and fearing for her life, she initially stayed silent. It was only later that this witness bravely came forward and told police everything, even identifying Beltran Mendoza in a photo lineup. Her testimony gave investigators a clear picture of what happened to Yami and who was responsible. And I know there's going to be someone in the comments who will question why this friend waited so long to come forward, but we really don't know what Mendoza subjected her to over the course of her captivity, and further yet, she knew he was capable of extreme violence. Also, reading between the lines, I'm going to guess that this witness was likely a minor as well. On August 7th, 2025, a Texas grand jury formally charged the 27-year-old with Yami's slaying. But by the time the indictment was issued, Beltran Mendoza had vanished. Now a wanted fugitive, he remains on the run and has yet to be apprehended. Beltran Mendoza is originally from Mexico, which has fueled speculation that he may have fled the country to avoid capture in the wake of this crime. What began as a nameless mystery has become a quest for justice, and investigators remain determined to catch Beltran Mendoza and hold him accountable. On an August morning in 1971, a father and son traveling along Oregon's Redwood Highway stumbled upon a horrifying discovery. In the woods near the California border, they found the scattered skeletal remains of a young woman. The area was littered with trash, as if it were an illegal dump site, and it looked like someone had tried to conceal the body under debris. No one knew who this girl was, how she had perished, or why she was left in a lonely patch of forest. It took nearly 50 years for modern genetic sleuthing to finally identify her as Annie Marie Lehman. But learning her name is only the beginning, and what happened to Annie in 1971 remains unsolved. Annie Lehman was a 16-year-old girl from Aberdeen, Washington, who vanished under fairly murky circumstances in early 1971. One day, she was seen at home packing her bags, and when her sister asked where she was going, Annie advised that she was leaving with an older woman who was waiting outside. That older woman was later tracked down and allegedly told a relative that Annie had been taken to San Francisco and sold into a trafficking ring. Whether this story was true or just a rumor, it left Annie's family terrified for her fate. And stop me if you've heard this one before. Authorities assumed Annie left by choice and didn't launch any search for her, as was the style at the time. Seriously, I feel like I can just copy and paste that line into my scripts 90% of the time when a teen went missing in the 60s or 70s. On August 18th, 1971, only a few months after Annie left home, the travelers discovered a human skeleton in Josephine County, Oregon, just outside the town of Cave Junction. Investigators determined the remains were a female in her late teens or early 20s, likely deceased for several months. Notably, she also wore 2 rings, including one with a mother-of-pearl stone into which the letters AL had been scratched. This haunting clue would only fully make sense decades later when those turned out to be the victim's initials. Investigators also found a disintegrating road map of Northern California camping areas stuffed in the girl's pocket. This suggested the unknown young woman might have been traveling toward California. From the condition of the scene, police strongly suspected foul play. The body's hidden placement and the remote location indicated that someone may have dumped her there intentionally after eliminating her elsewhere. Unfortunately, due to the skeletal state of the remains, the medical examiner couldn't determine an exact cause of death. With no identification and no obvious cause, the case was difficult from the start. Police checked missing persons reports and sent descriptions of the victim and her clothing across the region, but no match was made. By the end of the 1970s, the Jane Doe case went cold, and the victim remained unidentified for decades. In August 2004, cold case detectives reopened the file and used new forensic methods to try to identify her. In an absolutely bizarre coincidence, they released a facial reconstruction of the victim, and to help her case be more relatable, they named her the Jane Annie Doe. Of course, at the time, the investigators had no idea that Annie was actually her name. The reconstructed face was publicized, generating a few tips, but nothing that led to a name. In 2016, another approach was tried: forensic isotope analysis of the girl's hair and teeth. The isotope tests suggested a possible upbringing in the northeastern United States. This clue led to some false leads, but ultimately it proved to be a dead end. Annie was actually from Washington, not New England, and there's no record of her having ever even visited the Northeast. The real breakthrough came from cutting-edge genetic genealogy. In 2018, the nonprofit DNA Doe Project took on this Jane Doe as one of its cold cases. Technicians extracted DNA from the old bone samples, though the genetic material was highly degraded by decades of storage. They were able to find family members in the UK and New Zealand, and eventually used those hits to construct the family tree out. In early 2019, these connections were used to find a woman in Washington state who turned out to be the sister of the Jane Doe, and she gave a DNA sample for testing. In March 2019, it was confirmed that the Jane Doe, nicknamed Annie, was indeed Annie Lehman of Aberdeen, Washington. With Annie identified, investigators turned to the bigger question of what actually happened to her. One possibility is that Annie left Aberdeen of her own accord and headed south, only to fall prey to foul play along the way. The map of California campgrounds in her pocket supports the idea that she was traveling toward California. She may have hitchhiked or gotten a ride with someone dangerous. If Annie was on the road and encountered a predator, that could explain how she ended up hidden in a rural area off the highway far from home. During the early 1970s, it wasn't unheard of for hitchhiking teenagers to come to harm at the hands of opportunistic predators, and Annie may have been one such unfortunate victim. Also, I'm sure it won't come as a surprise to any of you watching, but California and the Pacific Northwest were a massive hotbed for serial predators during this period. The other main theory is based on the troubling account from her family, that Annie was effectively trafficked. In this scenario, the unknown older woman who accompanied her was an accomplice who delivered Annie into the hands of a criminal organization. According to the second-hand story shared with Annie's relatives, she was sold into an illicit operation in San Francisco. If that story is factual, Annie might have been held against her will and harmed by those who exploited her. Her slaying could have occurred at the hands of traffickers, and they may have dumped her body in the Oregon woods while moving along a route between Washington and California. Investigators acknowledge both scenarios as potentially true, though they haven't provided much further insight than that. What they've let the public know is that Annie's passing definitely did involve foul play. Authorities continue to gather information in hopes of proving one of the theories, and ultimately, finding out who was responsible for Annie's demise. More than 50 years have passed since Annie Lehman's life was cut short, but the case remains open and unsolved. The identification of her remains in 2019 was a major victory, but it's only the first step. In 2021, a crew of tree planters working in a remote Washington forest made a grim discovery: a human skull with multiple bullet holes. For 4 years, the identity of this John Doe remained unknown, until cutting-edge forensics finally put a name to the remains in 2025. The skull belonged to Anthony Croy, a young man who had vanished from Portland, Oregon, nearly 3 decades earlier. Anthony Croy was 21 years old when he disappeared from the Portland area in late 1995. Known to friends by the nickname T-Bone, Croy was a talented tattoo artist. By the summer of 1995, Croy was living a transient lifestyle, couch surfing and staying in cheap motels with friends while trying to get by. Perhaps the last confirmed sighting of Croy was in August or September 1995 at a motel in northeast Portland. He had been staying there with 2 friends, but when those friends left, Croy remained behind and was never seen by his loved ones again. Croy's friends and family reported his disappearance to the police. However, as an adult with a somewhat nomadic lifestyle, authorities initially suspected he might have left on his own. However, Croy's family never believed he would willingly drop out of touch, and indeed all records of his life seemed to abruptly stop in 1995. Fast forward to April 26, 2021, in a remote wooded area near Lake Merrill in Cougar, Washington, when a crew planting trees for a logging company stumbled upon a human skull. Detectives from the Cowlitz County Sheriff's Office responded and noted 2 entry and 2 exit holes in the skull, clear evidence that this individual hadn't perished of natural causes. This gruesome find kicked off a new investigation, but the immediate challenge was identifying the victim. A search of the area on May 15, 2021, aided by sniffer dogs, uncovered a femur bone, but no personal belongings or identification were found. The partial remains were designated as an unidentified John Doe case and initially yielded few clues, and the case went cold. In 2025, with traditional methods exhausted, the Cowlitz County Sheriff's Office turned to advanced genetic genealogy as a last resort to identify the remains. Investigators submitted a DNA extract from the bones to Othram, who identified a potential relative, who turned out to be the sibling of the John Doe. With this information, the unidentified remains were officially those of Anthony Matthew Croy, born December 4, 1973. Nearly 30 years after Croy's disappearance, his family finally had an answer about his fate. Authorities announced the identification in early September 2025, and unsurprisingly noted that the investigation into his disappearance would now be investigated as a slaying. Given how recently he's been identified, there hasn't been much time for theories to form about the case yet, but a few things are known. Investigators know where Croy's body ended up and have a general time frame of when he perished. The fact that he was last seen at a Portland motel before presumably being shot and dumped in rural Washington is a critical clue. This suggests the perpetrator may have transported him out of the city after slaying him there. Given Croy's social circle and transient habits, investigators will likely attempt to interview old friends and associates to find anyone with a possible motive to harm him. However, given the lifestyle he was living, and given that there was no meaningful initial investigation done, this may be extremely difficult at this point. The Palace of Placentia was a famous Tudor royal residence by the River Thames and was a favorite of Henry VIII and the birthplace of future queens Mary and Elizabeth. It was here, in the summer of 1553, that King Edward VI spent his final days before succumbing to illness, under circumstances that historians debate to this day. Edward was born on October 12, 1537, the son of King Henry VIII and his third wife, Jane Seymour. He was the long-awaited male heir for whom Henry VIII had broken with the Catholic Church. His birth sparked high hopes for the Tudor dynasty, but tragedy struck early, and Edward's mother Jane died just 12 days after his birth. As Henry's only legitimate son, the young prince was doted upon by his father and the court. Thankfully, we have a visual representation of King Henry's hopes for the child. In this painting from 1538, by Hans Holbein the Younger, the future king is depicted holding a golden rattle, intended to evoke the imagery of his father's royal scepter. The Latin inscription both glorifies Henry VIII and wishes that Edward will surpass the glory of his father in all things. In January 1547, when Edward was only 9, Henry died, and the boy ascended to the English throne. Because of his youth, a regency council was appointed to govern until he came of age. Edward's uncle, the Duke of Somerset, took charge as Lord Protector, ruling in the king's name. Somerset advanced Protestant changes that aligned with Edward's own devout zeal, but his regime faced economic woes and unrest. In 1549, Somerset was ousted by John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, who then controlled the government. Although Edward grew more assertive in his mid-teens, this duke remained the chief power behind the throne. Despite his age, Edward wasn't a passive figurehead, at least in his teen years. Contemporary accounts suggest he took an active interest in affairs of state, especially religious policy. He was fiercely Protestant and intent on continuing his father's break from Rome, even if that meant pushing further than his father had. Edward's reign lasted only 6 years, 1547 to 1553, but it was pivotal in steering England toward Protestantism. He was the first English monarch raised as a Protestant, and under him the Edwardian Reformation transformed religious life. Key reforms included imposing the Book of Common Prayer on every church, allowing clergy to marry, and commissioning the 42 Articles, a statement on the doctrine of the Church. Through these measures, Protestantism took firm hold in England, aligning the kingdom with the broader Protestant Reformation in Europe. While many of his reforms were rolled back by his Catholic half-sister Mary, Mary's counter-reformation proved temporary. When Elizabeth I took the throne in 1558, she reinstated her brother's Protestant policies. This continuity meant that Edward's reign had planted the seeds of an Anglican church that would endure. Edward's reign was also marked by a succession crisis that underscored his dynastic significance. As Henry VIII's only son, Edward embodied the Tudor hopes for stability, yet he was a minor king who obviously had no children of his own. By early 1553, Edward fell gravely ill, and questions of succession loomed. The law said the crown should pass to Edward's elder half-sister Mary, a Catholic, then to half-sister Elizabeth, a Protestant. Unwilling to see England restored to Catholicism, Edward, guided by John Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland, attempted to alter the succession. The king ordered a document drafted to exclude both Mary and Elizabeth from the throne. Instead, Lady Jane Grey, his Protestant cousin, and by pure coincidence, I'm sure, John Dudley's daughter-in-law, was named as heir to the throne. This gambit failed. When Edward died, Jane was proclaimed queen for just over a week before Mary mustered support and seized the throne. Nonetheless, Edward's desperate bid to install a Protestant successor reveals how important his religious legacy was to him, even in his final days. But let's get to the mystery at hand. Why did a healthy young king take ill and perish, apparently out of nowhere? In early 1553, King Edward's health began to rapidly deteriorate while he was staying at the Palace of Placentia. He developed a high fever and a harsh cough that worsened over several months. Doctors noted that he was coughing up blood and that he was suffering from wasting and swollen limbs, amongst a wide variety of lesser problems. Modern medical analyses conclude that Edward likely succumbed to tuberculosis, possibly complicated by a severe pneumonia. Whatever the precise cause, it was beyond Tudor medicine to cure. An autopsy reportedly found putrefied ulcers in his lungs, stark evidence of advanced disease. On the evening of July 6, 1553, 15-year-old Edward lay on his deathbed. According to the lore, his final words were a plea to God to defend the realm from Catholicism and continue support for the Reformation in England. And with those pleas, Edward VI faded into history. Edward's death was initially kept secret while Northumberland moved to install Lady Jane Grey as queen. Within days, however, Mary Tudor had claimed the throne with popular support. The deceased king was interred at Westminster Abbey on August 8, 1553. Notably, Mary ordered a Catholic funeral mass for her half-brother, which many believe to be an intentional humiliation of his legacy. Naturally, the untimely death of a teenager invited dark rumors. Some contemporaries suspected foul play, whispering that Edward had been slowly poisoned by someone at his court. As evidence, they cited the apparently unusual symptoms he was suffering from, such as his hair falling out and his skin appearing to have a somewhat blue tint. The Duke of Northumberland, who stood to benefit by placing his daughter-in-law on the throne, was the chief suspect in these theories. However, no proof of a plot ever emerged, and modern historians dismiss the poisoning story as implausible. Notably, if the Duke had been involved, he wouldn't be doing much talking about it. In August 1553, he went on trial, and perhaps in an attempt to save his own life and that of his family members, he professed to be Catholic once again. Notably, this didn't work out for him, and he met his end on August 18th, 1553. Though, as we'll see in a later segment in this video, one of his sons would go on to be extremely prominent. This trial wasn't related to his alleged involvement in the death of King Edward, but rather related to his attempt to install Lady Jane Grey on the English throne and his promotion of Protestantism. Modern scholars can't entirely dismiss that John Dudley was involved in a poisoning plot against Edward. However, the evidence for it simply isn't there. Notably, at the time, medicinal treatments often did more harm than good, and the symptoms seen by Edward near the end are thought to have been a result of imperfect Tudor medicine. It's more likely that the aggressive treatments given to Edward, which could have included toxic substances like mercury or arsenic, inadvertently worsened his condition. The consensus today is that Edward likely died of tuberculosis, exacerbated by the common medical treatments of the time. In retrospect, Edward VI's legacy is paradoxically one of unrealized potential and significant achievement. Long overshadowed by the reigns of Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, Edward's short rule is now recognized as a crucial turning point that paved the way for Protestant England. The liturgical and doctrinal changes he set in motion permanently altered the Church of England. Even though Mary tried to restore Catholicism, Edward's reforms proved resilient, resurfacing under Elizabeth I and cementing his legacy. Many scholars have speculated that had Edward reached maturity, his extreme religious zeal may have led to a much more austere version of Anglicanism. But Edward didn't live to shape such a future. He died at only 15, leaving others to carry on or attempt to roll back his vision. In the early morning hours of June 27, 1994, a horrific scene was discovered on a quiet wooded road near Tacoma, Washington. A passerby stumbled upon the lifeless body of 25-year-old Michael Johnston sprawled beside a parked car. Later that same day, about 5 miles away, a second body turned up alongside an overgrown private road. It was 19-year-old Rochelle Robinson, and this act of violence against these two individuals would unveil a tangled web of disturbing events, infidelities, and potential occult connections. It soon emerged that Michael and Rochelle shared a secret. They had been lovers despite Michael apparently being happily married. On the evening of June 26, 1994, the pair met up with friends in Tacoma for a session of a little fantasy card game called Magic the Gathering. Sometime around 11:30, Michael and Rochelle left this magic gathering in separate cars. This was likely to avoid drawing attention to the fact that these two weren't just tapping land in magic, they were also tapping each other. Investigators believe they rendezvoused moments later at a parking lot in Spanaway, near Rochelle's home, where Michael parked his own vehicle. From there, he joined Rochelle in her gray 1988 Mazda. The secret couple then drove off together into the night, heading to a secluded lover's lane. This was a remote, tree-lined area by the Tacoma Sportsman's Club shooting range, and couples often use this spot to seek some very private time away from prying eyes. But it turns out that they didn't have to fear prying eyes, but lurking, predatory eyes in the woods, staring at them intently while they embraced. Sometime after 1 o'clock that morning, that quiet rendezvous was savagely interrupted. Evidence suggests an assailant approached the Mazda under cover of darkness. The attacker likely flung open the car door to find Michael and Rochelle in an intimate moment, catching the couple off guard. In the chaos, the evidence suggests that they were forced to hastily dress themselves. Rochelle was later discovered wearing Michael's t-shirt inside out, a sign of the frantic, split-second nature of the attack. Under threat, the couple was dragged out of the vehicle. Michael appears to have been restrained, possibly with handcuffs, and made to kneel near the front of the car. The evidence suggested he was then eliminated execution style, right in front of Rochelle. With Michael neutralized, the predator turned his focus to Rochelle. Small puncture wounds on Rochelle's neck indicated a blade was pressed heavily to her throat, forcing her compliance. In his clutches, Rochelle was driven away from the first scene, presumably in the perpetrator's vehicle, to a second isolated location about 5 miles down the road. There she met a violent end, being stabbed repeatedly in what appears to have been a fit of completely unbridled rage. Pierce County Sheriff's investigators pieced together the events from 2 separate crime scenes. Rochelle's Mazda was found parked where Michael was shot, confirming that the attack began at that Lover's Lane site. Michael's abandoned car was later discovered back at the Spanaway parking lot, exactly where the couple had met up, which validated their late-night rendezvous plan. The weapons used by the perpetrator weren't discovered. However, there was something out of place. This was a very peculiar cardboard box used to conceal Rochelle's body at the second site. Investigators identified it as a specific type of white cardboard carton used to hold high-grade printing paper, generally used in professional print shops. Forensic tests suggested the box hadn't simply blown in from the roadside since it hadn't been left out or received any weather damage. That meant that it was likely brought by the perp and may have been stored in his home or vehicle for some time before the attack. And keep this in mind, there was absolutely no occult or ritual symbolism found at either scene, since this will be important very soon. From the start, authorities felt the double slaying was intensely personal. The viciousness directed at Rochelle, far more wounds than inflicted on Michael, suggested that the attacker's anger was focused on her. Detectives theorized that Michael was a passive victim, tragically caught in the crossfire of someone's obsession with Rochelle. This meant the most likely suspect pool were people in Rochelle's life: an ex-boyfriend, a jealous admirer, or a stalker driven by unrequited passion. Before long, a very credible lead emerged about a deranged stalker who had entered Rochelle's life recently. Rochelle had told friends and coworkers about a young man who had been following her in the spring of 1994. This man would lurk at her workplace, a fast food restaurant, for hours, and even trailed her home on multiple occasions. She was very scared of him, and he simply wouldn't stop following her, so she tried an alternative plan. Rochelle mentioned to her friends that she had once gone to lunch with him, hoping to defuse the situation. The stalker, however, took this as validation that he was being noticed, and doubled down on his efforts to quote-unquote win her over. Naturally, Rochelle was terrified of this individual, and it appears that he had continued to actively stalk her up until her untimely passing. After the attacks, an acquaintance came forward with a detailed description of this individual. He was described as a white male in his mid-20s, standing around 5'10" and being of average height. Naturally, this incredibly generic description alone wasn't going to do much good, so a forensic sketch was drawn up, but ultimately it led to nothing whatsoever. Police considered this unidentified man a key person of interest, suspecting that his obsession with Rochelle could have escalated into violence. However, some speculated that if this was the case, that a more extreme form of rage might have been dedicated towards Michael as well. Personally, though, I don't necessarily see it this way, since if this is correct, we're dealing with a delusional stalker. Working within this disturbed framework, he may have seen himself as rescuing Rochelle and freeing her up to be with him. He may have wanted to take out Michael in a cold, clinical way that in this delusional framework he believed would scare his unrequited love as little as possible. Naturally, investigators also scrutinized other people close to Michael and Rochelle. Standard procedure in cases like this is to look at the victim's romantic partners. Michael's wife, Janet Johnston, was briefly under the microscope due to her husband's infidelity and the fact that Michael had a large life insurance policy. However, Janet cooperated fully, passed a polygraph test, and had a solid alibi, and the authorities eliminated her as a suspect. Also, I know some of you are saying to yourselves right now that perhaps she was working with someone else, but as you'll see very shortly, she definitely wasn't. Likewise, Rochelle's former boyfriend was also examined, and despite any hurt feelings he might have harbored, there was no evidence tying the ex to the crime. In short, the obvious suspects aside from the stalker didn't pan out. With the case growing colder by the month, Michael's widow Janet took an extra step to keep it alive, and she hired private investigator Jim Wright to conduct an independent inquiry. Wright's fresh eyes combed through the evidence and interviews, but unfortunately these initial investigations came to nothing. In the absence of clear suspects, Jim Wright began exploring more unconventional theories, and here's where we take a hard turn into the occult theories of the case. While delving into Michael's personal life, Wright discovered that Michael had a deep interest in role-playing games and occult subjects. Michael's hobby wasn't just casual, and he owned a large collection of books on what has been described as black magic. Now, I have to be frank here and tell you, I don't know if he had the Lesser Key of Solomon on hand, or if we're talking about some Dungeons and Dragons rulebooks here. That said, given the echoes of the satanic panic still reverberating across the nation at the time, I think it's a fair assumption that we might be talking about the latter. This revelation prompted Wright to wonder if the double slaying could have been connected to some kind of occult angle. Perhaps Michael and Rochelle had crossed paths with a dangerous fringe group or individual through their gaming and alleged occult circles. And then things went further off the rails, and Wright decided to consult a psychic named Nancy Meyer for any insights that might crack the case. In a dramatic twist fit for a 90s daytime talk show, Meyer claimed to have a vision of what happened that night, and it was radically different from the police theory. According to Meyer, Michael was not an incidental victim at all, but the primary target due to some ritualistic dispute. She claimed to see an older man in his late 30s, along with two younger accomplices, who supposedly crept up on the couple in the woods. In her story, these assailants were part of an occult group with Michael, and they accused Michael of violating some kind of cult rules. Meyer said the confrontation was planned, and the cult leader first eliminated Rochelle, and then brought Michael to another location to do the same to him. She even described the cult leader as looking suspiciously like Anton LaVey, which I suspect wasn't a coincidence. Law enforcement officials politely thanked Meyer for her quote-unquote valuable input and advised they were definitely totally going to look into the theory. That is, right after they got through their review of some hot tips about an interdimensional Bigfoot, or perhaps Big Feet, phasing in and out of the area. Okay, so it's probably not going to surprise anyone from the way I presented this case that I don't believe the occult angle here in the slightest. That's not to say that there's never occult angles to true crime cases, but this ain't it, and it isn't even close. This looks like a pretty disturbing situation of a grieving widow who got a large life insurance payout being targeted by at least one grifter. I don't necessarily think the private eye was wrong to look into the occult element. After all, the case had gone cold, and he was paid to examine every possibility. But what the psychic did was clearly a work of pure fiction, which doesn't align with the evidence even in the slightest. I think it's fairly obvious that the stalker is the culprit here, and there's one circumstantial reason why I believe this is the case. He was actively stalking Rochelle at work, and if he was innocent, he would have figured out what happened to her really quickly. If he was simply a stalker that didn't develop into a violent predator, I believe he would have come forward to the cops as soon as possible. After all, he was working within a delusional framework where he thought there was at least some sort of friendship between the two of them. He never came forward, and the evidence suggests he stopped stalking her at the time she was slain. This suggests to me that he knew she wasn't going to be at her fast food job anymore because he was the one who ended her life. As for how this case can be solved now, after so many years, that's the real tough part here, since it doesn't look like any genetic evidence was left behind by the perpetrator. As winds howled and rain lashed down on the night of November 29, 1980, 32-year-old Granger Taylor walked out of his parents' farmhouse in Duncan, British Columbia in Canada. He climbed into his pickup truck and disappeared into the darkness. He left behind a bizarre handwritten letter for his family, claiming he was embarking on an interstellar journey aboard a spaceship and would return in 42 months. By the next morning, when Granger failed to show up, his parents discovered the note, complete with a hand-drawn map on the back pointing to a nearby mountain, and realized he was gone. Granger Taylor was a bit of an unusual guy, to say the least, and everyone who knew him agreed he was equal parts brilliant and eccentric. He was a self-taught mechanic who could build or fix almost anything. He dropped out of school in 8th grade and focused entirely on restoring vehicles, heavy equipment, and even a fighter plane. Granger often came up with bizarre inventions and was a beloved member of the local community. By his late 20s, Granger's interest turned skyward. Inspired by science fiction, he built a life-size spaceship out of old satellite dishes on his family's farm. It wasn't flight-worthy, but this backyard UFO, complete with a wood stove and a bed, became his personal hideaway, where he would spend hours gazing at the stars. He even rigged up a radio device in his makeshift spaceship that he believed could potentially receive extraterrestrial messages. At first, Granger's project was treated as an eccentric but harmless hobby, but as his talk of actual alien contact grew more earnest, friends began to worry about his mental well-being. As 1980 went on, Granger's behavior grew erratic. Family noted his mental health declining, and he began using acid heavily. This experimentation with substances may have fueled his otherworldly visions and made him increasingly detached from the world around him. Disturbingly, he told friends that aliens were in contact with him and would arrive during a storm to take him on an interstellar journey. Sure enough, on the night of November 29th, 1980, a powerful storm struck, with howling winds and heavy rain battering Vancouver Island. That evening, Granger left a diner around 6:30 and drove off in his truck, never to return. Before he departed, Granger had taped a note to his parents' bedroom door. This now infamous letter explained that he was leaving to board an alien spacecraft for 42 months and that he would return afterward. He left all his possessions to his family, noting he wouldn't need them where he was going. On the back of the message, he had sketched a rudimentary map of a nearby location, Waterloo Mountain, with an X marking a spot. He had even updated his will beforehand, replacing the word death with departure, which seems odd to me if he really believed that he would be returning. When his parents discovered the note the next day, the family was baffled and alarmed. Police were notified, and search parties combed the woods around the area marked on Granger's map. Despite the storm's wreckage blocking many roads, they scoured logging paths and trails, but found nothing unusual. No sign of Granger or his truck ever turned up. His worried parents even kept the back door of their home unlocked for years afterward, just in case their son might come back one day. Some relatives and friends held out hope that 42 months later, as he had indicated, he might miraculously return, but June 1984 came and went with no sign of him. In March 1986, nearly 6 years after Granger disappeared, a grim discovery provided a clue to his fate. Forestry workers on Mount Prevost, near the spot marked on Granger's map, found the site of an explosion in the woods. A large blast crater was littered with fragmented vehicle parts. The investigation determined that the debris came from a pickup truck. The vehicle identification number on one recovered piece matched Granger's missing truck. Among the wreckage, they also found small bone fragments and shreds of clothing. Forensic pathologists examined the bone and determined that it was consistent with human bone, dispelling any hope that it was from the local fauna. Granger's mother identified one scrap of fabric as part of a shirt she had sewn up for him not long before he left, strongly suggesting the remains were his. Since this was the mid-'80s, DNA analysis wasn't available to confirm the bone fragments were his at the time. Also, I'm going to mention right now that the Royal Canadian Mediocrity Police investigated the case. So yeah, there's basically no chance these were actually preserved. The blast site was very close to the location indicated on Granger's hand-drawn map. It was evident that a massive explosion had occurred, and the coroner's report noted a blast radius of roughly 600 feet. Granger was proficient in explosives, and was known to handle dynamite for blowing up tree stumps on the farm, which aligned with the scene. The coroner concluded that Granger had been carrying a massive amount of dynamite in his truck and that it detonated, reducing both him and the truck to nothing. In 1986, the coroner officially declared Granger Taylor dead, listing his cause of death as an explosion, and dating it to the night of November 29, 1980. Notably, some locals had reported hearing a mysterious loud boom on that stormy night back in 1980, around the time Granger would have been near Mount Prevost. It was dismissed as thunder at the time, but in hindsight, it seems likely that sound was the blast echoing across the hills. To many, these findings seemed to close the book on the mystery. Granger's fantastical space voyage had ended in a tragic, earthly explosion. His family, however, never held a formal funeral for him, as they couldn't fully say goodbye without definitive answers. Even with this conclusion, not everyone was satisfied, and in the years since Granger's passing, his legend has grown and attracted numerous theories. And at this point, I should probably mention that I must have gotten 10 comments over the last year or two asking me to cover this case. One theory is that Granger intentionally set off the blast, weaving the celestial voyage story as a compassionate cover for his family. Some of his relatives did come to believe that his mental breakdown and substance use culminated in such an act. However, some of Granger's close friends and family members dispute this, and note that Granger legitimately believed he was going on an interstellar journey with his extraterrestrial pals. Some have even gone so far as to question whether Granger even perished in the explosion at all. They cite that the bone fragments found were never DNA tested as potential proof that he arrived. People who subscribe to this theory generally believe that he simply moved along and started a new life elsewhere. There have been alleged sightings of him in South America and in the American South, but none of these were ever confirmed. Over the years, a range of even more far-fetched theories has emerged, turning his conventional mysterious story into the stuff of legends. Some people truly believe Granger was taken by extraterrestrials that night, exactly as he wrote. In fact, his mother Grace reportedly maintained until her death that her son had left Earth with aliens and was out there exploring the cosmos. Some UFO enthusiasts have speculated the aliens could have caused the truck's explosion to provide cover. Others imagine that Granger might yet return someday, unchanged, due to the very real phenomenon of time dilation. Without getting into the weeds too deeply, Granger's 42 months on a spaceship traveling near light speed could be anywhere from hundreds to billions of years on Earth. Another more far-flung theory suggests that Granger's brilliance with machinery drew the interest of a government agency, and that perhaps agents took him for a covert project. Under this theory, the note and the explosion were acts of intentional misdirection so they could spirit him away. My own completely speculative theory is that the entire thing was an unfortunate accident, and I do need to clarify that this is just my own opinion based on the evidence. Granger Taylor did perish on that stormy night, but he did legitimately believe that he was going there to rendezvous with otherworldly beings. I believe he may have thought that he needed a signal to set off to have them pick him up, sort of like a beacon. Under this theory, he would have set up the explosion to call the spaceship, but he would have done so from a safe distance, so he could have returned and be taken up. Everyone agrees that Granger was a really good-hearted guy who was loved by everyone, so we know that he wouldn't have sought to endanger anyone, hence the desolate area. Despite being familiar with dynamite, I speculate that he got in over his head with the amount of explosives he was using, and that something went wrong during the setup. I'm no expert on anything beyond a Roman candle, but I doubt that a massive thunderstorm is the ideal time to rig up something like this. In the end, I think it was all a tragic accident, and that Granger Taylor did possess the subjective belief that he was going to be going on that 42-month journey. Despite more than 40 years having passed, Granger Taylor's disappearance remains a haunting, unsolved mystery. Hey everyone, Jimmy reminding you to like and subscribe and to tap the notification bell. Also, don't forget that you can support my channel through YouTube or through Patreon for as little as $1 a day. It's just after 6 on the evening of July 4th, 1928. High above the English Channel, the world is serene, viewed from the luxurious cabin of a state-of-the-art Fokker aircraft. Inside, one of the most powerful and influential men on the planet, the Belgian financier Captain Alfred Lowenstein, is wrapping up some work. He's flying from London's Croydon Airport to his home in Brussels, accompanied by his personal staff of 6. The flight is smooth, the weather perfect. At an altitude of 4,000 feet, Lowenstein excuses himself and walks to the rear of the plane to use the washroom, and the minutes start to tick by. 10 minutes pass, and his valet, Fred Baxter, grows concerned. He knocks on the door, but there's no answer, and at this point, according to the official narrative, panic starts to set in. Fearing his employer has fallen ill, he forces the door open, and what he finds is a scene of horror, not for what it contains, but for what it doesn't have. The small compartment is completely empty, and just a few feet away, the aircraft's main entrance door is unlatched, flapping violently in the slipstream. Alfred Lowenstein, the third richest man in the world, had simply vanished into thin air. Known as the Belgian Midas, he was a figure of immense power and public fascination. Born in Brussels in 1877 to a banking family, he possessed a natural talent for finance. He was already extremely wealthy by his 30s, but in the roaring 20s, his fortune exploded, in the good way. Lowenstein had the foresight to invest heavily in the disruptive technologies of his day, hydroelectric power and artificial silk. One of his companies brought electricity to developing nations, and his massive investments yielded enormous profits. To put it in modern terms, Lowenstein went all in on Nvidia stock and just kept riding the bull. At his peak, his net worth was the equivalent of over $1 billion today, a fortune that placed him behind only Henry Ford and John D. Rockefeller. He was a friend to kings and was consulted by heads of state, even receiving an honor from the British government. His lifestyle was famously extravagant, and he owned a fleet of private planes, a stable of prize-winning ponies, and lavish homes across Europe and America. But his business empire was a complex and tangled web of highly leveraged ventures. This high-risk, high-reward strategy made him a financial titan, but it also meant his entire empire was precariously balanced. He had created a world of powerful allies and, undoubtedly, ruthless and well-moneyed enemies. The events that unfolded aboard his plane only deepened the mystery. On board were his pilot, Donald Drew, a mechanic, Robert Little, his valet, Fred Baxter, his secretary, Arthur Hodgson, and two stenographers, Eileen Clark and Paula Biddalon. After Baxter raised the alarm, the story told by the crew was one of confusion and panic. Yet the pilot's actions were anything but straightforward. The logical response to a passenger falling from a plane would be to radio for help and land at the nearest airfield, which in this case was at Saint-Anglevaire in France. Instead, Drew chose to execute a risky landing on a remote beach near Dunkirk. It was a bizarre decision, one that seemed to prioritize privacy over protocol. When the plane was discovered by a unit of French soldiers on training maneuvers, Drew was evasive before finally admitting that his billionaire passenger was missing. This strange behavior, choosing an isolated landing spot and delaying the report, immediately suggested that this was no ordinary accident. It gave the impression of a crew needing time to align their stories, or perhaps, as some have theorized, to tamper with the scene of a crime. The official inquiry that followed was just as perplexing as the incident itself. Lowenstein's body was found by fishermen 15 days later, on July 19th, his identity confirmed by an engraved wristwatch. An autopsy, requested by his family, determined he had a partial skull fracture and several broken bones, and crucially, that he had been alive when he struck the water. This ruled out a heart attack or poisoning mid-flight. The investigation, however, was curiously muted. Despite the flight originating in the UK and the body being found in French waters, the official inquest was held in Lowenstein's home country of Belgium. This jurisdictional choice raised a lot of eyebrows at the time, and you're about to see why, because the Brits were about to investigate and find something very weird. The Belgian inquiry largely ignored the most damning piece of physical evidence. The British Air Ministry, using Lowenstein's actual plane, conducted a test to see if a person could accidentally fall out. This wasn't part of the Lowenstein inquiry itself, but rather a separate investigation into the airworthiness and safety of this common model of passenger plane. An officer, wearing a parachute, threw his full weight against the exit door repeatedly at an altitude of 1,000 feet. It opened a mere 6 inches before the force of the slipstream slammed it shut, throwing him back inside the cabin. The ministry's conclusion was unequivocal, and they found it would have been impossible for someone to accidentally open the door and fall out. Despite this, the Belgian inquest disregarded the physics and settled on a verdict of accidental death, a ruling that conveniently allowed his massive insurance policies to be paid out. In a final unsettling chapter, Lowenstein was buried in his wife's family tomb in an unmarked grave, a funeral his widow didn't attend. With the official story so full of holes, 4 main theories have persisted for nearly a century. The first, accidental death, is the official verdict, but is almost entirely debunked by the British Air Ministry's door test. The second theory, that he did it himself, was immediately floated in the press, fueled by rumors that Lowenstein's complex financial empire was on the brink of collapse. Yet this theory runs into the same physical impossibility as the accident scenario. He still would have had to somehow force the door open against incredible pressure. And let's just say this financier wasn't the second coming of Augustus the Strong, the Saxon Hercules. Also, yeah, anyone who knows me in my personal life knows that I'll never miss an opportunity to throw in a good Augustus the Strong reference, but I'm getting off topic here. Back to the point, the billionaire financier could have had help from his employees to make it all look accidental, and there's actually potentially a reason for this. One factor that I need to mention here is that Alfred Lowenstein was Catholic, and had the fall been known to be his own doing, it would have impacted where he could have been buried. The third and perhaps most compelling theory is that he was eliminated by his own crew. Under this theory, he was either eliminated by politically powerful hands or even his own wife, who stood to inherit his massive fortune. This theory claims that the entire crew was complicit and that the beach landing was necessary to replace the original door, which had been completely removed and jettisoned with the body. This aligns with a fisherman's report of seeing an object resembling a parachute, perhaps the door itself, falling from the sky that evening. Ultimately, there's not enough evidence to say whether this theory is accurate or not. The final theory, that Lowenstein faked his own death to escape financial ruin, is supported by the strange burial, but largely contradicted by the discovery and autopsy of his body. I say largely here because his body was solely identified by a personal item that was found on him. Those who support this theory suspect that he could have used his patronage of hospitals and medical schools to illicitly obtain a cadaver for his great escape. My personal speculation, given how weird the circumstances are, is that he may have tried to fake his own death with the help of his crew, but failed and actually perished in the fall. In the end, the truth of what happened to Alfred Lowenstein at 4,000 feet remains elusive, lost to the winds over the English Channel. The official verdict of an accidental death seems to stand in defiance of all evidence, which indicates that he couldn't have just fallen out of the plane accidentally. Ironically, of all the theories, the only one which really makes no sense at all and doesn't match the evidence in the slightest is the official theory. This whale tale begins not in the dim light of a dockside tavern, filled with the tall tales of sailors, but in the respected halls of 17th century science. Its protagonist is Sir Robert Sibbald, a man whose credentials lent immediate and formidable weight to his claims. He was a physician, a founder of the Royal College of Physicians of Edinburgh, and the first and founding professor of medicine at the University of Edinburgh. He had been appointed Geographer Royal for Scotland, and he was a foundational figure in the Scottish Enlightenment. He was, by the standards of his day, a meticulous observer of the natural world, so much so that he is often regarded as the father of cetology, the study of whales and dolphins. It's this reputation that makes his 1687 account of a strange creature washed ashore so compelling and persistent. In his work Phalanologia Nova, a pioneering text on the whales of Scotland, Sibbald described a female whale that had stranded on the island of Orkney. It was, he reported, a type of sperm whale, but with one astonishing defining feature, an enormous dorsal fin. To convey its scale, he reached for a familiar maritime analogy, describing the fin as being similar to the mizzen mast of a ship. This single evocative phrase is the bedrock of the entire legend. A mizzen mast is the third and shortest mast on a large sailing ship. Yet even so, the comparison suggests a structure of almost unbelievable proportions. Depending on the vessel, such a mast could stand anywhere from 20 to 80 feet tall, implying a fin that would dwarf any known anatomical feature in the animal kingdom. Beyond Sibbald's foundational account, the evidentiary trail for the high-finned whale grows cold with astonishing speed. For a creature with such a dramatic appearance, its appearances in the historical record are remarkably few and far between. The entire case rests on just two primary events, separated by more than 250 years, each plagued by its own significant flaws. The first, Sibbald's 1687 observation, remains the most credible simply due to the reputation of the observer. However, despite being the first person to study whales and dolphins in a true academic sense, it's still a single anecdotal account from over 3 centuries ago. No physical evidence was preserved for future scientific scrutiny. Further, the description of the fin, as noted, was based on a poetic but imprecise metaphor, leaving its true size and shape to the imagination. Sibbald could have simply been using hyperbole to describe the size of the fin, since he very clearly didn't actually say that the fin was the equivalent in height to a mizzen mast. The second major sighting, and the only significant one of the modern era, occurred in September 1946. An unusual creature was reportedly seen trapped for 2 days in the Annapolis Basin of Nova Scotia in Canada. If Sibbald's account was ambiguous, this one was a case study in scientifically useless data. Local observers provided estimates of the animal's length that were wildly inconsistent, ranging from as little as 10 feet to as much as 100 feet. This tenfold variance suggests that no one got a clear, measurable look at the creature. The estimates for the all-important dorsal fin were equally vague and biologically absurd, also ranging between 10 and 100 feet. Despite the animal being confined to a basin for a full 48 hours, no photographs or sketches were taken of the creature. Further, this was a fishing town with whalers. If the whalers in the town truly believed they were seeing a wondrous animal, well, I suspect they may have bagged it and tagged it. The evidentiary basis for this whale is, therefore, extraordinarily fragile. It consists of one unverified report and one modern report so riddled with inconsistencies as to be meaningless. In the decades since 1946, an era of widespread photography, advanced whale-watching tourism, and sophisticated scientific surveys, there have been no new, credible sightings. The 1946 event also highlights a fundamental challenge in observing marine life: the immense difficulty of accurately judging scale and distance on the open water. With no landmarks for reference, a smaller object seen up close can easily be mistaken for a much larger object farther away. It's a perceptual trap that can easily give rise to monsters, and the hopelessly broad estimates from the Annapolis Basin suggest that the observers had fallen squarely into it. With the direct evidence for the whale proving to be so flimsy, the investigation must turn to alternative explanations. The most compelling and widely accepted scientific theory posits that the legend is not about an unknown animal, but rather a misinterpretation of a very well-known one. Orcas have the highest dorsal fins of any whale or dolphin, and dorsal fins of over 6 feet are routinely observed. Add in issues with frames of reference on open water, and this provides one explanation why this legend may have flourished. A thorough investigation requires the consideration of all possibilities, even those that are remote. While the orca misidentification theory stands as the most robust explanation, it's worth exploring whether a genuine biological anomaly could account for the sightings. One possibility is that the creature was a whale with a rare genetic mutation. It's conceivable that a mutation could cause abnormal growth of the dorsal hump or the fin, creating a larger structure. While genetic mutations are a constant in nature, the scale of the required change is problematic, since it would require an extremely substantial change. To put it in context, This would be like a human having legs that are 7 feet long. It's not outside the realm of imagination, but from evidence and observation, it's just something we know doesn't happen. However, there is a related concept called atavism, which is the reappearance of a lost ancestral trait. In rare instances, modern whales have been born with small vestigial hind limbs, a throwback to their land-dwelling ancestors. The primary flaw in this theory is the lack of any fossil evidence to suggest that the ancestors of whales ever possessed such a giant dorsal structure. Atavism can only reawaken a genetic blueprint that once existed. It can't create one from scratch. That said, the fossil record is of course extremely incomplete, so it's always possible there is actually a whale ancestor out there with a high fin that science hasn't yet discovered. Others believe that the high-finned variant of the common whale we have today may have been a very rare species which was hunted to extinction. As you'll recall, the earliest sighting was in the late 17th century, which was the very dawn of modern animal science. Believers in this theory propose that Sibyl's whale may have been the last of a creature that has never been fully documented by science. Since you can't prove a negative, this really just remains a fascinating idea at this point. Putting this theory aside, perhaps the most conclusive piece of evidence against the existence of the creature comes not from what was seen, but from what was never seen. This is the argument from silence, and its source is one of the most extensive, detailed, and brutal records of human interaction with the natural world. These are the logbooks of the global whaling industry. From the 18th century through the late 20th century, commercial whaling was a massive industrial enterprise. Fleets from America, Europe, and later Asia hunted whales across every ocean on the planet, from the equator to the polar ice. Whaling vessels were floating factories and data collection centers. By law and custom, the ship's mate was required to keep a detailed daily logbook. These logs recorded the ship's position, weather conditions, and, most importantly, every whale sighted, chased, struck, and captured. They noted the species, the size, and the yield of whale oil, and every dimension of the whale itself. Despite this, not a single high-finned whale of any species was found at any point. Ultimately, the story of this high-finned creature is likely more valuable as a lesson in the process of science than as an unsolved zoological and scientific mystery. However, the legend's persistence speaks to our enduring fascination with the mysteries of the deep ocean and what creatures might be secretly lurking beneath the waves. Personally, against all the odds, I want to believe that a small population of these majestic high-finned whales roam the seas. Imagine the scorching sun over Saqqara, Egypt's vast city of the dead, where archaeologists brush away golden sand in search of a legend. They're hunting for the tomb of Imhotep, a man who lived over 4,600 years ago, yet whose genius still looms large in history. Imhotep wasn't a pharaoh, but his name echoes through time as priest, architect, physician, and later as a god of healing. Strangely, for all his renown, nobody today knows where this brilliant figure's final resting place lies. His tomb remains one of Egypt's most interesting unsolved mysteries, one that has now eluded scholars from numerous civilizations for millennia. During the 27th century BC, at the dawn of Egypt's third dynasty, Imhotep rose from the ranks of commoners to become one of the most trusted advisors of Djoser. He bore lofty titles according to an inscription on Djoser's own statue base, a fact that perhaps makes him the first non-monarch recorded in history. These titles tell us that Imhotep was Djoser's chief minister, the high priest of the sun god's temple, and the kingdom's lead architect and builder. Such honors on a king's statue were unprecedented for someone not of royal blood, suggesting Imhotep was regarded almost as a member of the royal family. In fact, this has led some scholars to believe that he must be a relative of Djoser, perhaps his brother, though this is highly controversial. Imhotep's name literally means "he who comes in peace," and he certainly made his mark peacefully through construction and general wisdom. He's most famous as the master architect behind Pharaoh Djoser's tomb, the step pyramid at Saqqara, which was the first pyramid ever built in Egypt. Prior to Imhotep, Egyptian tombs for royalty were flat roof structures made of mud brick called mastabas. Imhotep's breakthrough was to use stone as a building material on a massive scale. Around 2600 BC, he pioneered stacking mastabas in diminishing size, creating a six-tiered pyramid that soared roughly 200 feet high. By constructing Djoser's pyramid complex in limestone, Imhotep revolutionized Egyptian architecture. He effectively turned the pharaoh's burial site into an eternal palace of stone, ensuring King Djoser would be remembered as a god on earth. Notably, in a sense, this worked, because Djoser's name is still widely known today, even by those with only a passing interest in Egyptology. Imhotep lived a long life, apparently surviving Djoser and serving subsequent kings. His name even appears in the unfinished pyramid complex of Djoser's successor, Sekhemkhet, and records suggest Imhotep died in the reign of King Huni, the last ruler of the Third Dynasty. Notably, in modern times, Imhotep has attracted most of his attention for his architectural work, while to ancient Egyptians his status as a healer was of even greater renown. Interestingly, he's believed to be the first person in recorded history to record numerous diagnoses and the treatments for them. In short, Imhotep was a universal genius of the Old Kingdom: architect, engineer, priest, physician, and sage all in one. Imhotep's legacy didn't end with his death. In fact, it only grew. For the next 2 millennia, Egyptians revered Imhotep's memory so deeply that he was eventually deified. By the New Kingdom period, scribes worshipped Imhotep as the patron of wisdom. They saw in him the embodiment of intellect and learning. In the late period, from the 7th to 4th centuries BC, Imhotep's cult really blossomed. He was officially recognized as a god of medicine and healing. Temples were dedicated to Imhotep, priests served in his name, and people offered prayers for cures to illness. The Greeks who later occupied Egypt were so impressed by Imhotep's healing reputation that they linked him to Asclepius, their own god of medicine. Evidence of this posthumous fame is found throughout Egyptian history. In the Ptolemaic era, after Greek conquest, a famous inscription known as the Famine Stela imagines King Djoser appealing to Imhotep to save Egypt from a 7-year drought. Ironically, by this time, Imhotep's reputation had far exceeded that of his patron, as well as virtually every other ruler of Egypt. The Greek rulers of Egypt continued to build and patronize temples to Imhotep. It's unclear whether they recognized him as a real man who once lived, or a divine figure who walked the earth to assist the ancient Egyptians. In essence, Imhotep the man became Imhotep the myth, one of the very few non-royals in Egyptian history to be elevated to godhood. This extraordinary status is a testament to the impact he had on the Egyptian imagination. Considering Imhotep's towering reputation, one might expect his tomb would be a prominent monument at Saqqara. Ironically, however, Imhotep's tomb has never been found. For well over 150 years, Egyptologists have scoured the Saqqara necropolis and beyond, but the location of Imhotep's burial remains elusive. This missing tomb is more than just an archaeological curiosity. It's potentially a historical gold mine. If discovered intact, Imhotep's tomb could reveal priceless information about his life, his family, and his era. Personal inscriptions or artifacts from his burial would shed light on the man behind the legend, filling gaps in our understanding of Egypt's third dynasty. In other words, finding Imhotep's tomb could greatly enhance our knowledge of this important figure's life and career. It would also serve to peel back some of the layers of legend that were later overlaid on top of the historic individual. Scholars generally agree he was laid to rest somewhere in the vast royal cemeteries of Memphis, likely at Saqqara. Two main theories have emerged about the tomb's location. Some experts argue that because Imhotep was so closely connected to Djoser, he could have been interred in or near Djoser's own monumental enclosure. Imhotep is specifically mentioned by name on engravings at the site, though these talk about his accomplishments and don't specifically mention him being buried there. Djoser's complex was sacred ground, and later legends even suggest Imhotep might be hidden under or around the step pyramid itself. Notably, large sections of Djoser's complex remain unexcavated, leaving room for hope that Imhotep's tomb could lie concealed in those unexplored zones. Others believe Imhotep was given a grand tomb in the general cemetery for high officials of his time. North Saqqara is dotted with massive mastaba tombs of Third Dynasty nobles, some as big as small pyramids. Imhotep's resting place could be one of these large mud brick mastabas, or beneath one, awaiting identification. In fact, British archaeologist Walter Emery in the 1960s became convinced that a particular tomb, called 3518, in North Saqqara, was Imhotep's final resting place. This tomb had an unusually complex layout of chambers for cult rituals, and clay ceilings bearing King Djoser's name, which hints that someone of very high status was buried there. But more on Emery's search for Imhotep in a moment, since he did discover something else magnificent that is a potential clue to the location of the tomb. Some other scholars believe that Imhotep's tomb might have been discovered at some point in the past, but not recognized due to heavy damage or missing inscriptions. In short, under this theory, the famous tomb could be hidden in plain sight, an unassuming ruin already dug up but never linked to Imhotep because time erased its markers. Others believe that there's the potential that he wasn't buried in Saqqara at all, given that little is known about his early life. The quest to find Imhotep's tomb has led archaeologists down fascinating paths, sparking discoveries even when the prize itself stays out of reach. A dramatic chapter of this search began in the 1930s with Walter Emery, a renowned Egyptologist who dedicated years to hunting Imhotep at Saqqara. Emery had noticed a curious concentration of large ceramic jars and broken ibis bird mummies on the desert surface in part of North Saqqara. These ibises were sacred to Thoth, god of wisdom, a deity closely associated with Imhotep. The jars dated to the late period, many centuries after Imhotep's time, suggesting they were left by pilgrims visiting what they believed was Imhotep's burial site. Emery theorized that later devotees trekked to Imhotep's tomb to offer mummified ibises in his honor, leaving behind heaps of pottery. If his theory was correct, the tomb of Imhotep should lie nearby. Armed with this clue, Emery began large-scale excavations at North Saqqara in the 1960s. What he uncovered was astonishing, though not in the way he expected. Below the sand, Emery's team found a maze of underground catacombs full of animal mummies, a secret cemetery of ancient sacred creatures. There were tunnels filled wall to wall with ibis mummies in jars, others with hawks and falcons, and even areas for baboons and bulls. This turned out to be the sacred animal necropolis, an enormous religious complex from about 2,300 years ago, where people buried animals as offerings to the gods. Emery had stumbled on one of the most important late-period sites in Egypt. The discovery was a sensational find in its own right, shedding light on how ancient pilgrims worshipped Imhotep and Thoth with animal offerings. But amid all these mummies, Imhotep's personal tomb was still missing. Emery did identify the aforementioned mastaba as a strong candidate for Imhotep, though admittedly he couldn't prove it himself. His excavations there revealed those cult rooms and Djoser-inscribed ceilings, raising his hopes. Yet, frustratingly, no definitive proof emerged, and it's been suggested that the reason the site has so much related to Imhotep's life is because it was a devotional site rather than a tomb. It's necessary to keep in mind that the people worshipping Imhotep at this time were about 2,300 years removed from the life of the man himself. To put things in perspective, we're now about 2,300 years removed from the lives of those Imhotep worshippers. In 1970, as Emery continued digging in hopes of that breakthrough, he suffered a stroke at the site. He passed away in Cairo a few days later, ending his quest without the ultimate success he had sought. Emery's lifetime search for Imhotep had instead unlocked a different treasure, the vast animal cult complex, but the man he sought remained in the shadows. In the decades after Emery, various Egyptologists have revisited the search with fresh eyes and new technology. Ground-penetrating radar surveys have identified some intriguing anomalies under the sands of North Saqqara. There are hints of large rectangular structures that could be candidates for Imhotep's tomb. These buried structures, however, remain unexcavated, essentially X marks on a map awaiting future exploration. Thousands of years ago, Imhotep helped immortalize King Djoser by building a house of stone for his spirit. Yet Imhotep's own immortality has taken a different form. Not a known tomb or mummy, but a legacy of legend and a puzzle that refuses to be solved. The tale of Imhotep's tomb is a reminder of how much of the ancient past still remains hidden. Taijin Kyofusho is often described as a culture-bound syndrome from Japan, and it involves a profound fear of embarrassing or offending others through one's behavior or appearance. It's frequently associated with excessive self-consciousness about bodily functions or perceived personal flaws. Historically, Taijin Kyofusho attracted attention in the mid-20th century when Japanese psychiatrists began to classify unique conditions reflective of cultural norms. The term Taijin Kyofusho loosely translates to the disorder of fear of interpersonal relations. It's suggested that the conceptual framework for this condition partially derives from collectivist values in Japanese society, where harmony and social cohesion are highly valued. Any perceived breach of etiquette can cause profound distress for those with the disorder, which may explain why this anxiety is so socially oriented. In the 1970s and 1980s, the condition started to gain international recognition when clinicians from different countries compared culture-bound syndromes worldwide. Researchers noted that while social anxiety disorders could appear anywhere, there was something different about the presentation of this one. What differentiated Taijin Kyofusho was the extreme emphasis on the sufferer's concern about being a source of discomfort to others. This led to deeper discussions on how cultural values shape the expression and classification of mental health conditions. Eventually, Taijin Kyofusho was included in discussions of culture-bound syndromes in the DSM-4. Treatment approaches can include cognitive behavioral therapy, exposure therapy, and pharmacological interventions.